Welcome everyone. I want to do a welcome first of all. Welcome you to the ANAM Comhrá, and the two Irish words. ANAM is the word for soul in Irish, and Comhrá is the word for discussion or discourse in Irish, but it actually has a deeper meaning than that. Our language is rich in poetry compared to other languages, I believe. And Comhrá means falling into conversation. And that's what I want this evening to be about. So it's not a formal kind of symposium or talk. It's very much a chat around the fireside, this wonderful fireside here. And this fireside belongs to Lillian's family, the Egans, is that right?
Yeah.
And it's an amazing building, and it's the backdrop for this conversation because I wanted to recreate that idea of a fireplace. Possibly on a cold evening I should have lit an actual fire. I should have organised that. We're going to have a discourse, a chat, a Comhrá, following a couple of stories from me. We'll then have a little bit of a performance from Ewan Madden, which will lead us into a performance by Sheila Flitton, who is an actor who played the Banshee in the film The Banshees of Inisherin. So I came across the chair that was used in the film, which was included in the installation that I ran, the first installation that I've ever run in Connemara in the summer. And I decided to get in touch with the actor because it turned out that my mother-in-law knew the actor, and she agreed to do a short performance as part of this discourse, this Comhrá. The one thing I want to do before I tell a couple of stories is to thank Fionnuala. So I have been on a journey for a long time. My background is industrial design. It's the design of mass-produced objects. And that's what I did for 25 years or so at Design Partners. And during that time, I had reason to question what I was doing. But I was aware of Killruddery because it's just up the road from where I live, and it's just down the road from the studio where I worked. And I've always wanted to come into Killruddery and meet Fionnuala and Anthony. Anthony's not here just yet. And see if there might be some kind of thing that we could do together. I got an opportunity through the Design and Crafts Council to run an installation, and I seized it because they were offering funding. And I submitted for this event, but I didn't have a venue for it. So the venue for the installation in the summer was in Connemara, and my whole intention was that I wanted to recreate an experience of discovering a disused, abandoned, discarded place, a cottage or an outbuilding in the landscape, place artefacts in that place and respond to that place, that context with those artefacts to create a discovery experience for people. They encounter it, they look through the window of the building and they see things that makes them feel emotions and makes them remember things and makes them perhaps value things that we normally discard and we sort of ignore or we kind of walk by without thinking, whether it's the old abandoned barn or whether it's the thing that's been thrown on the ground, the machine that doesn't work anymore and you just kind of discard it on the side of the road, whatever it might be, to try to elevate that again. And it goes back to a couple of stories. So the first one I'm going to describe is related to my industrial design background and the design of mass-produced objects. I designed a computer mouse, and I had very carefully crafted the original, what we called shape model for this computer mouse. So the design process involves sketching and drawing, but then making a model which represents the shape of the design, and that gets captured in three-dimensional CAD software and all that kind of stuff, so that it can then go on to be manufactured. But what I was interested in crafting is crafting this singular object and perfecting it as much as I could. So it was ergonomic, and it was beautiful, and it had all the things that I cared about my influence of the landscape and my influence of the handheld and the tactile surface and all those things. And I achieved that goal in this object, in this one single object. And that went to be manufactured and went onto shelves and was sold. And 3 years later, I got an email from the client, or Design Partners, the company I was working with, got an email from the client saying, amazing, we just sold the 100 millionth version of this mouse. 100 millionth version of this mouse, this one design. And I had two responses to that. One response was, that is just so amazing, because for me, the design of everyday objects is what I do. But to hear that there was 100 million of these things in existence was both a fantastic thing, because I was putting this simple object, the basic tool of modern life, the mouse, into 100 million people's hands, or even more perhaps. So that was fantastic. I felt good about that. And of course the client was very happy, because they were making X amount of dollars or whatever it was. But on the other hand, a voice screamed in my head. And this was 2001. It was before we were really starting to have the real conversation around ideas like sustainability and design for recycling and reuse and all those kind of things. I popped out of college with training, which was design something beautiful, respond to your brief, build the biggest market that you can through the design of this object, and make as many as you can. But the consequences of that kind of training and that kind of attitude as a designer led to 100 million plastic objects being made, which cannot be disassembled, which cannot be reused once they're broken, and they end up in landfill. A single object that I designed, repeated 100 million times, ended up in landfill. So that's its cycle. And the story ends with me coming back from a meeting in Carlow and stopping in the Wicklow Hills, coming over the Wicklow Gap, stopping in the Wicklow Hills for a walk in the forest, as I do so many times. You'll know this. And I came across landfill or fly tipping in the forest. And in that fly tipping, there was a mouse, the computer mouse that I designed. So in a 10-year period from about 1997 or 1998, when I designed the mouse, through to walking through a forest and finding it in a dump. The second story was in the aftermath of my father's death. And sometimes I often talk to design students about the idea of having epiphanies in their work. You just you make a leap in your process or in the way you think. But guess what? Epiphanies come from crisis. They almost never come from us going about our daily lives and being happy. You don't tend to have epiphanies, because an epiphany is a result of some kind of interruption. And for me, I suppose the crisis was my father dying, and I think at the time I kind of accepted that and processed it and it seemed to be okay. But a year later, I felt that I wanted to go on a journey. And I went on a journey to where he grew up. And he grew up on the shores of the Shannon Estuary, a place called Kildysert, or near Kildysert in South Clare. And he would drag me, kicking and screaming as a young boy, out to the farm to meet the cousins, and then out to the islands in the Shannon Estuary. And one of the islands is called Cannon Island. Canon as in the clergy, the C-A-N-O-N, because there was a ruined abbey on this island. The island is a figure of 8 shape, or an infinity shape. And as I've said to many of you before, this infinity shape is something that needs to inspire something. I'm not sure what it's going to be, but it will inspire something. This infinity figure of 8 shape. And on one end of the figure of 8 is the ruined abbey, which was ruined since the time of Henry VIII and the dissolution of the monasteries. So the history on that island goes back, and you can see it in the stones. And it goes back to geological time, because my mother's a geologist, and she met my father by going on field work out to those islands, out to Cannon Island, and going around the edge of the island where the limestone was exposed and looking at fossils. And she met the families that lived on that island when she was out there. So there's that. For me, Cannon Island represents childhood, my mother and father's life, all those things. So for me, it was going back and processing my father's passing and all those things. And I canoed out to Cannon Island, and I thought I was very clever. I thought I'd absorbed all the knowledge that my father had about the currents in the river and the tidal conditions and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, oh yeah, I'm a real boatman. I know what I'm doing. And in fact, I was very lucky. It only took me 15 to 20 minutes to get out to the island. It took me about 5 hours to get back because I completely messed up the return journey, but that's a whole other story. I visited Cannon Island and I spent 3 nights there. And on one end is a farm with a cottage, with a pier, which is where you typically land. And that farm, that cottage, was owned by my father's best friend. And that would be the place that we would go to. And yeah, I would be sitting around the fireplace well into the night, waiting for the tide conditions to be right or whatever it might be, while they were chatting. And Morgan, my father's best friend's father, playing the fiddle in the open fireplace, just like this. And wanting to probably go home and all that kind of stuff, but very fond memories of that. I revisited that cottage, and it was disused since the late 90s. It was in a bad state. Obviously people had visited and they'd kind of thrown things on the ground, emptied cupboards, emptied drawers, messed the place up a bit. There were broken windows and open doors. The roof was caving in and things were quite disheveled. And I came across a couple of things which were included in this installation. This is one particular touchstone, if you like, the elbow of a fiddle. And this was the fiddle that Michael McMahon played when I was a kid in that fireplace, and it was on the ground, broken to pieces. And alongside it was a broken gramophone. And if you were paying attention when you were going around the installation, you might have seen a gramophone amplifier hanging from the ceiling like a lamp. That was there as well. And I rescued some of those artifacts. But they represented something very important for me. So one of the things I noticed about this was that there's a repair. So somebody might know what these are called, but one of them has been sort of hand carved. So Michael McMahon probably got this fiddle made by a Clare fiddle maker, but he was out on the island and he broke one of these and he had to sort of repair it. He was out on his island. And they would have only gone into the local town, Kildysart, maybe once or twice a week, not even that, once or twice a fortnight or a month even, to get the sugar and to get the essentials that they couldn't get on the island. And they might have got into Ennis maybe once or twice a year. So he wasn't going to go, he wants to play his fiddle, he wants to repair it, so he just whittles one. And this is something that we don't do anymore. You know, we break something, we go and get a new one. So it represents that simple idea. But also, it has this story in it. You know, the musical instrument is this fantastic object anyway, but I knew who played this. You can see the pattern of where he held it for probably 50 years he played this fiddle. You know, 50 years of his life. And still smells of smoke. You know, that sort of thing you can't design. But what I want to do is I want to try to design that in to a new thing. So what I'm responsible for is designing newborn objects. But I somehow want to design the newborn which has this life already lived, a deeper meaning. So that's what spoke to me in terms of finding that. I then made my way around to another cottage which was on the other end of the island near the Abbey. And even as a child it was disused and abandoned. And it was already overgrown. I don't remember even being able to see the cottage when I was a child. I just knew that there was one there. And I worked my way around to it, following the trail of where my mother would have been looking at the limestone. And I could see where it was because it was just a dome of trees and overgrowth and everything like that. And I said, okay, I'm just going to penetrate this nest of undergrowth or an overgrowth and find my way into the cottage. And I encountered the bedroom window. And I wiped the grime away from the bedroom window and peered in. And there was a sewing machine, a Singer sewing machine, which we're all familiar with. Our mothers or our grandmothers might have had a Singer sewing machine with the wheel on the side. And there were still spools of thread and a box of bits of fabric over to one side. It was covered in dust and it was a bit disheveled, but it was almost like someone had been using it and then it wasn't being used anymore. It was sort of frozen there. And in the corner was a bed, one of those tall, narrow double beds that he would have had, but with a white sheet on it. And the significance of that only came to me later. And a cupboard. probably made by a local carpenter, in the town, Kildysart, with a dress hanging on it. And one of these kind of handmade sort of shrine grotto. I don't know what the word is. Claudia, you might know what the word would be for that. But just a kind of a simple pitch-roofed box lined with wallpaper, and little crosses on the ridges and the corners, and rosary beads hanging on it, and a little statue, and that was just over in the corner on a shelf. And it was just the experience of, it was like looking back in time. It was time traveling, and it was a frozen moment. And I realized that there was a way of life that we had in the past, and this room seemed to represent that, a simpler life where the things in it were of the place. I went home to my mother from Limerick, and I asked her about the cottage, and she said, "Oh, that was Mrs. Hastings. She was a lovely woman. I met her. She'd bring me in for cups of tea. The mad English woman bashing rocks over in the shoreline." And she died in 1971, and I realised the significance of the white sheet. So she'd been waked on the bed. She'd been taken to the ruined abbey to be buried, where all the islanders were buried. And they put the door on the latch, and the few people who'd been there for the wake or whatever had left. And I'm pretty sure I was the next person to visit that place. And what I wanted to do was recreate that moment for people of looking through a window and seeing back into the past. But then in doing that, to kind of see if there are ways that we can identify the good things that we might have done in the past, not out of any romantic notion or nostalgia. I wanted to make it an exercise in understanding how we used to value things and how we used to make things by hand or by using materials that were there out of necessity, not out of a romantic notion. And that all leads into the discussion that we're going to have, those two stories. And hopefully it will make sense as we do that. For me directly, it's about identifying a set of values and principles that I can create by and I can design by for myself, first and foremost. So I'm going to introduce the panel. I'll start with Anne, if that's okay. So I first met Anne in 2013 or thereabouts. Very involved in the Crafts Council, as it was still then, was it? As a curator, you're a maker yourself in terms of your training and background. Jewellery is?
No, I was a sculptor.
Sculptor, excuse me. And Anne was so supportive of some of the early work that I was doing with Cathal, who I'll introduce next. You might have seen a chair in the installation, which is French walnut, beautiful contemporary piece of fine furniture. Myself and Cathal designed that together, and Anne really supported that being included in a series of exhibitions between about 2012 and 2015. Then Cathal, I've just mentioned, he's a fellow industrial designer. He's still on the front line of industrial design, and that's why he's here, because he's facing into the reality of doing what I hope to do as a kind of a practitioner who's more and more of an artist, but he's still the designer of mass-produced things. And he's got that responsibility in his soul, but he's also a sculptor and a maker and a craftsman like myself in that sense, and a thinker and wants to bring values in the same way as me. And we worked together for many years, and we just kind of connect in a way that, I think anyone who's creative out there, if you've got someone like a Cathal that you can bounce ideas off or you can have conversations with, it's just gold, absolutely gold for the creative person, whether you're an artist or a hobbyist, doesn't really matter. But so he's my kind of ANAM Comhrá in design and all those things, and friend.
To the tale of two sheds.
And Cathal will say it's a tale of two sheds, yeah. So my shed and his shed is linked by this kind of invisible
Internet.
something. Yeah. Then Angela O'Kelly. I met Angela probably around the same time as I met Anne, and Angela is a wonderful maker. Would you describe yourself as a
Jewellery designer?
Jewellery designer, yeah. But she's made these, you saw the wonderful crafted paper amulets and neck pieces in the installation, and you look at them first and you think, are they ceramics? Are they? What is this material? It's like magic, but they're intricately made from paper or layered materials, and Angela's wonderful experimental approach to it. But they're just beautiful objects, so simple. I mean, I wish I could be so kind of simple about what I do. I think I maybe overcomplicate things in my head
He
sometimes.
just called you simple then.
No. It's simply in the most possible way. But Angela is also just a wonderful spirit, and she came down to the installation in Connemara, and just a bright spirit, and yeah, we have to interact more. We have to do more together. We keep saying that we will, but then Michael Murphy is a recent acquisition in terms of being a friend. No, that's a horrible word, isn't it?
Where's the receipt?
Michael did to me what I did to a few other craftspeople and artists and people like that a few years ago. So I was getting quite frustrated with working as an industrial designer, doing mass-produced stuff for all kinds of reasons which we don't have time for. But one of the things I did about 12 or 14 years ago was to go and meet other kinds of creative person, and just have chats with them and hope that they would be willing to bring me into their little studio or workshop or whatever it might be and just have a chat. And so many of them just embraced me. It was wonderful. And Michael just turned the tables on me last year. Was it only last year? It feels like a lifetime ago.
Little more, but yeah.
But he got in touch with me probably through Instagram or something like that and said, do you mind if I rock over and have a chat? Love to see what I'm doing. And I said, absolutely do. And we just kind of clicked immediately, and since then the rest is history really, because he's got a beautiful turned wooden vessel in the installation, which for me is the most beautiful thing. And then he very kindly took on the challenge of making a stick chair, which is a sort of a contemporary take of the traditional vernacular stick chair. I humbly hope did some sketches in this stupid schematic, dimensions and everything, but handed it over to Michael, and he waved his magic wand, used an oak felled in Wexford. So this was the embodiment of what I want to do, which is use materials that you know where they came from. He used hand tools. The values he brings to the work is all about what I'm trying to do myself, using hand tools, and he used a froe to split this log of oak. He came back to me very proudly with this length of oak that he split, and he didn't need to do any more to it. He'd split it, and you didn't need to sand it or plane it or anything. It was just this beautiful split piece of oak, and that became the back of the chair that's in there. And that's what I want to do more of, and I only wish I had the skill that Michael brings to things, and the spirit as well. Then Claudia Kinmonth, the absolute authority on country furniture and furnishings, but not just furniture, but the objects of everyday life in the past. And she has a passion about this, which I like to think I share, but I think I'm only just getting to know Claudia. We've just had a couple of calls before this, and we've met for the first time this evening. And I already know that we're going to have a lot of conversations in the future. And I could only hope to tap into that knowledge that you have and bring it into the work that I do. It's just wonderful to have you. And she's written, if you have one book in your collection, if you're interested in vernacular furniture and things, this is the one. This is the sales pitch. Yeah. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. It really is. And that actually ties back to the cottage. So Claudia has also done a lot of research on this cottage. And I'm sure you will be both having a conversation with Lily or with Claudia about that. Yeah, you've already met.
Oh yes, around the far side. Yeah.
So that may be expanded on later or may not. And then Linda King, I've only met quite tonight in person. So we've had a couple of calls, and but Linda is a design historian, but more on the contemporary history and material culture. So really kind of 20th century and more recently, Irish design history. Mm-hmm. And what I'm hoping is that between Claudia in the slightly more distant past, Linda in the slightly more recent past, and then say Cathal and Michael and Angela really working in the now, that we can knit together what we can take from the past and bring forward into the future. I'm going to hand over now to Ann and we'll go into the discourse.
Thank you, Peter. And I hope body heat is keeping everybody warm. Feel free to get up, walk around a little bit if you get too cold. This is a discourse, not a seminar, it's a chat. So if you strongly agree, disagree, or want to make a point, feel free to join in, because we'd like this to be a conversation amongst all of us this evening. We have a lot of expertise here, both practical and academic, in the panel, and it's also a really good opportunity to ask them questions later on. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a bit of a chat for the next 40-50 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the floor. But as I say, if you're moved before then to ask a question, dive in and we will welcome you here around the fireside. Over the past few weeks, Peter and I have talked a lot about this project, and each conversation has been a joy, because just like listening to him this evening, there's such a charge or an energy when he talks about the project. And to me, I think there's two reasons for that. The first one is that there's a material research process that's going on, where Peter is gathering objects, and both found objects, made objects, new and old, and he's gathering them to create a kind of a personal vocabulary to try and articulate the values that he's spoken about. But the other thing that's going on that's intertwined with that is a very deep emotional resonance with everything that he collects. And for him, those objects express memory, connection, place, longing and loss. And if you talk to him about any of the objects that are in the installation, you'll understand very quickly, because the stories he can tell you about the maker, the maker's father, the maker's son, and there's a lot of father and sons in the project, you start to get a sense of how connected those objects are. And to me, I think it's that emotional resonance that makes it so compelling, and it's the reason that I think we all got enthused about the project in the first place. And I think Peter collects things because they express longing and loss. And I think those feelings of longing and loss are ones that actually on some level we're all feeling, through that sense of disconnectedness from the making of things, from nature, from a sense of agency to be able to do anything about the crazy shape of the world. So we decided earlier that this is possibly the beginning of a movement that's starting here. So I'm going to encourage you all to join in and become part of the army of meaningful makers that marches on from this evening.
And I would just add to that as a designer, and I know I'm speaking very much to kind of other people who may be involved in a design process in some way, there are various principles that you learn about either in school or that you accumulate as you go along. And they often track back to Dieter Rams' design principles. There's a list of 10 principles that Dieter Rams was responsible for. I know there are other manifestos and other principles, but what I want to do is recognize that they're not obsolete. We need to add to those in the sense of what we do in the future. What I'm trying to do is understand how do we modify the ones that are there and then add to them to make sure that we have the full suite of tools to create as we go forward. So things like the selection of materials, or things like understanding the consequences of your choice, because we as people no longer understand the consequences of our choices because it's too abstract. It's like we can't predict what's going to happen with something. When we make a decision, it's almost like we can't predict what's going to happen as we go out. But designers need to do that. They need to find a way to be able to predict the consequences of what they're designing.
I've given Peter a task this evening, which is whenever he hears something that actually feels like it's close to one of those principles that he needs to define, that he points it out. I'll write it down. I've got a few already. And feel free to, if you see or feel something that you think could be added to that manifesto, bring it up to us as well. Linda, I'm going to start with you first. I'm slightly tempted to ask you to sum up the history of Irish design in a couple of sentences.
I could try.
Well, I suppose, you know, just thinking about what Peter has been talking about and thinking about the objects that are put into the installation here, and so much of what you're describing, Peter, was the objects of necessity. I mean, until relatively recently, we weren't a consumer society, we were an agricultural society, which is why we didn't have a design industry, because if you don't have an industrial design background, as in we didn't have an industrial revolution really in Ireland and anywhere up apart from up the north, and in certain areas like baking, paper making, alcohol production. So if you're not mass producing objects, you don't have a design industry that grows out of that, because you're not packaging things, you're not promoting things, you're not putting a nice shell around things. So I think what you're describing is really, you know, it's an Ireland that a lot of people would recognise up until certainly the 1950s, starts changing into the 1960s. And something we've been talking about today in terms of design history is Kilkenny Design Workshops. There's an event in Kilkenny celebrating that on Friday. And that was a way of importing design into Ireland, design for mass production, where design hadn't existed previously, or it had in pockets. And the legacy of Kilkenny design, myself and Cathal were talking about this earlier on, is absolutely vast. I mean, if you think of, only lasted 25 years, 1963 to 1968, government sponsored initiative. But if you think of things like the Telecom Éireann logo, that's Kilkenny design. The old OPW logo, that's Kilkenny design. And if you think about those, they're just two graphic design examples. But if you've got a visual image of what they are, the references to that they embody are from vernacular design or vernacular shapes. So Telecom Éireann, the old Clogaloch T&E, or the OPW logo, where you've got the concentric circles taken from somewhere like Newgrange. So in terms of bringing together the past and the present in something that is meaningful to everybody, I think Kilkenny Design Workshops, or KDW as they're called for short, is a really, really good example. And you could play that out across the textiles that they produced, the furniture that they created. When we get into the 80s as industrial design, it's far more widgets and bits and bobs that go into, mass manufactured electronics or.
Well, one of the observations I would have about that is that it chimes with a lot of things happened in the 60s which transformed our society. Mm-hmm. So when the installation in Connemara was in an old forge, and that stopped operation in 1965. Why? There's a couple of things, very, very simple things. There was a hardware store in Artefacts. So you didn't have to go and fix something anymore. You just went down to the hardware store and you got a new one. And since then, we've gone from the hardware store in the local village to the whatever it might be. No disrespect to those retailers.
But what you're talking about is consumer culture. I mean, it's when Ireland, it begins in the 1960s, and it's very multifaceted. And Kilkenny Design wasn't the only initiative, but the introduction of free second level education, the expansion of tertiary level. I teach an IDT in Dunleary, which was an old regional technical college, then Institute of Technology. I mean, they start really expanding in the 1970s, and that whole consumer culture, as we move towards EEC membership in 1973, is a huge catalyst for change. And we're also looking to America a lot for their take on consumer culture. RTE is set up in this is probably more design history than you bargained for, but like RTE is established on New Year's Eve 1961, so 61 into 62, and one of the biggest things that RTE broadcast for years on TV was American TV programs, things Get Smart, I Love Lucy, I Dream of Jeannie, because they were cheap. They got them cheap. So that created a desire for Americanized objects and more consumerism. So I kind of look at design history from the mid century onwards, and I'm fascinated because of that. And also you've got, my other kind of area of interest is Aer Lingus, and you've got Aer Lingus expanding in the 1950s and literally connecting us with the outside world. Mostly people coming into Ireland, but a few people going out, some on a one-way ticket, but others, travelling a little bit as well. So all of those external influences from Europe and America have a profound impact on Ireland, and we become, I think, an aspirational society that doesn't want the dresser anymore, doesn't want the thing that needs repairing, wants the new shiny.
Wants the new shiny thing, or the thing that's reflected in the TV, or
exactly. Aspirational. Yeah.
Aspirational.
How would you characterise where we are now, then, in terms of our design, our material culture, our visual culture?
I had a really interesting conversation with one of my students there yesterday or the day before, who was planning to write an essay, and said, well, I'm really interested in fast fashion, but I'm very conscious that is having such a profound impact, not only on the environment, but also the way people are treated in terms of mass manufacturing. And she said, I now buy secondhand clothes, and that would have been seen as, oh, you bought secondhand clothes because you were poor. Now you buy secondhand clothes as a statement, to say that, you are kicking back against that. So I think we're in a really interesting place where we're still buying lots of things that we don't need. And I think during COVID, people shopped for distraction or for comfort. She actually said, she said, I have friends who spent, or she knows of people who spent 500 quid shopping online for clothes that they never wore. And, so I think we're coming out of that real accelerated shopping for comfort, and we're beginning to take a little bit of stock. But, consumer culture, we're all part of it. We can't not be a part of it.
We all consume too much.
But we are at a place where I think, I hope we're reflecting a little bit more. But the Dieter Rams principles, or thinking first things first in Britain in the 1950s, designers have been debating this since the Industrial Revolution. They have been taking stock of what are we doing, how are we doing. The arts and crafts movement in the 19th century, why, Industrial Revolution, why do we need so many objects? Can we not be crafting individual objects? So it's not a new thing. It's a perpetual, ongoing, evolving conversation.
What's new is our awareness of the consequences now.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm going to come to Cathal next as a designer.
I'm Cathal Loughnane. I'm an industrial designer, and I want to heal.
You're among friends. But when Peter talks about you, he describes you as being at the coal face.
Yeah.
Which is
or in the belly of the beast.
Yeah, which is kind of dramatic.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he says about you is that you collect treasures, stories, connections, meaning, the sorts of meanings that Peter talks about with the objects he's selected in the installation. But he said that you don't get to use them very often in the industrial design process. There's not really so much space for you to bring those objects or those treasures. And I'm just wondering about that. Tell me about the process. Tell me about how it could improve. What kind of space could it make for that sort of meaning and richness?
I don't think it's quite accurate to say there isn't room to use them in the process. Absolutely do use them every day in the process, but you have to do it covertly. You have to kind of use your stories and the things that you build up, the insights that you develop over living a life, observations that come from conversations with friends, or reading a book or hearing a song, little truths that you're going, that's an observation about an experience or about life that is important to me. And personally, as a designer, I've kind of built those, and Peter knows this, it's like I built them up as kind of mantras over the years. I think these are important things to our experience with the products that we buy or the life that we live. And then I'll be able to pull them out like cards when I have a challenge or a project. And they're relevant forever, And I'm sure, I'm trying to think of one now, but it's all got to do with human connection and insight into product experience. And you build them up as a designer as kind of your armory to say, well, if I'm going to do a product, it's going to have meaning in it, even if it's a piece of plastic. If you think you've done 100 million, that my footprint is horrendous. And But I had a similar crisis of conscience in about 2007 or 2006 that Peter had, of like, why just endlessly designing stuff, endlessly, like producing mass consumer goods, and then realized that it was actually the financial crisis of 2008 that saved me, because I nearly stopped designing. I nearly gave up, went to another course because I felt what I was doing was kind of meaningless. And then the financial crisis happened, and suddenly the people who I was designing for realized that only stuff that has meaning, only stuff that has a value is going to sell now, or is of relevance to people. The financial crisis opened people's eyes up to where they were spending their money. And the endless, mindless consumerism and walking around the shops on a Sunday as a thing to do just ended overnight. In fact, those shops started to close on a Sunday. Remember, they used to be open every Sunday, and for a few years it just stopped because people started to be more conscious about what they were buying. And the conversation for me changed with the clients I work for and the brands I work for as well. They started asking questions like, how do we create a better connection with people? How do we do something more meaningful? How do we bake value into the work we're doing? Because nobody cares anymore. They're not blinded by, you know, the cheap price or the convenience of this something that I don't really need. They want something meaningful. So from that point forward, myself personally, but also the whole team that I work with here in Bray, there's a big team of designers that are like absolutely world class. And they design beautiful product experiences that go all around the globe. And I'm part of that as well. But every day we come in to do purposeful work, work that has meaning and value to people. If we're going to do it, it's going to mean something. Mm-hmm. And to me, that was my response to the crisis of conscience. It was kind of saying, I'm going to build the why into the work. Whenever I'm asked to do a piece of work, I want to know, why should it exist? Who is it for? How will it benefit them? Why should anybody care? Why is it a good use of resources? Before I even draw or think about anything, the why is first. And then we tell a story. And storytelling is the most powerful piece of design work. And the reason why it's hard and you need to do it covertly nowadays is because in my world, we are bombarded with the need for data. Everything's, where's the data on that? Using AI, using research, endless amounts of money spent on research and data. Give me metrics, give me information to tell me why this will be a success in the market. And we do that. And like the brands I work for spend huge amounts of money on that. But ultimately it comes down to, data can just give you information, but ultimately it comes down to what you do with that. And great design is about looking at all that data and coming to an insight and a point of view or a story and say, let's see all your data, here's what you should do. And that's how you build meaning into something and tell stories. My feeling is that in the world today, it's not a real statistic, but I'll use it anyway. 90% of the things that are created in the world today are sleepwalked into existence. Mindless design that's just produced without consideration and thinking. But there's like this sort of 10% of people who really care. And they're creating the future in the same way that Peter talks about the past. But they're creating it in a way that's like the guy who made the chair in the local village made it with real, like, this is my skill and it's for you, and we live in the same village, so I better get it right because I'll see you tomorrow. The people who care about creating the future of mass-produced experiences also tap into that. And they say, well, if we're going to do it, we're going to craft it with real value and meaning because we care about the people who are going to experience this. So it's like learning from the past to create in the same way for today.
But perhaps one of the ways to kind of capture that is this idea of, even if you're a designer for the mass-produced thing, that you act as if you're the designer for the friend who lives next door. So if you think that way, but you're applying it to a mass-produced thing, there's a chance that some of that connection will actually go into the consumer thing. There might be a way to bring them both together.
So I don't know if that answers the question.
It does.
You're making a point with industrial design.
Yeah.
Most people here might have an Apple phone, an iPhone. Hailed as one of the most beautiful pieces of industrial design. Well, we all know what the phone can do.
Yeah.
But as an object, it's a failure. Who here has an iPhone that doesn't have a protective cover on? It must be the only beautiful, sleek object, but it's totally inappropriate. It doesn't work. It slips out of your hand, falls to the floor. Everybody has a protective cover, so it's a total failure. So, what you're saying, industrial design, I totally agree with. People have to really think very deeply about the old form must follow function. You know.
Yeah.
I wonder
Absolutely.
if that lack of protective cover was intentional design. To buy a new iPhone.
I always think they spent so long learning how to make all the components so small, only for everybody to beef it up another 30% with the big cover. I don't really get it.
Yeah, I wouldn't be here to kind of preach for Apple. They have enough advertising going. But they did do something very interesting. They took something like telecommunications, which when I was a child was really meaningful. You had a Bakelite phone or something that was really of value. The object itself had significance in the home. And then over the course of my kind of growing up and going to college, they took the industry took telecommunications and made it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, down to a point where it was meaningless and meant nothing, and it was junk. You know, and it made it throwaway, completely throwaway. And then Apple went, we'll make it significant again. And they made that with the user experience and also the execution of quality of materials and design. And they said, we're going to make something significant here, and we care about it. Now, I totally agree with you. They built in flaw into it. You know, it has its flaws with it. But at least I think they did something with real intent, real consciousness, and said, we want to do something of value to lots of people. And, you know, lots of people really love their iPhone and really get a lot of value from the experience it gives them, you know. Whereas pre the iPhone, I was involved in the smartphone industry, and a lot of it was junk. Sorry?
Was that design-led or marketing-led?
I think it was Steve Jobs led. I think only Steve Jobs can answer that question because he's an iconoclast and a unique person in design history terms, a unique individual in terms of how he influenced the act of industrial design. So up until the Apple iPhone especially was launched, most companies, they would have in-house design teams or they would have consultants who would be churning new products year after year after year, and there would be a superficial level of design applied to, I would say 99% of products, not just 90%. And I was part of that.
Data.
You know, it was adding another technology to the thing, you know, making it faster, better by whatever marketing measure you care to have, and this is supposed to be good. Steve Jobs came along and turned that on its head, and he said, I'm going to give you this, and it's not going to answer all of your problems, but it's going to answer one particular problem, and it's going to be executed to the nth degree, whether you agree with it or not. He took a position, he took a particular position which has its flaws, but he did that very deliberately. It was a very deliberate decision, a very deliberate point of view. And I don't know how it fits into what I'm doing. For me, there are flaws in terms of the values that Steve Jobs and Jonathan Ive, and who's a contemporary of mine. Jonathan Ive is the industrial designer working with Apple, quite recently retired from that job. But the values that Jonathan Ive brings to design are the same values that I try to bring. And those values are not enough. And one of the things I'm trying to do is find a few more that we can really make a difference in the future objects. So the iPhone is an example of something which is flawed for me.
Well, there's an interesting thing around ethics, isn't there? Because it adds
Ethics.
value, but a bit like heroin adds value to someone who can't let go of their heroin in a way. Doesn't it? It's,
Yeah.
You know, you're hooked in it, right? So
You're hooked.
if something's of value to you, it should also add something to your life. So then it's like how design ethics, I suppose, comes into this as well, doesn't it?
It does, and
And also, I mean, I think the iPhone is, I think, research on waste, talking about things going into the landfill.
yeah.
I think phones made up a huge amount, didn't they? I don't know, I don't have statistics of that as well.
Yeah,
So,
it's enormous.
what is value added to people's lives is an interesting one as well.
But what is the price of that value? So we all want these things. We all want the car. We all want the phone.
Yeah.
We all feel that we have a right to a lot of these things now. we've developed a world where, as people, we feel we have a right to certain things, and perhaps we don't, or at least if we feel that way, guess what? There are consequences, and they're going to hit us. They're going to certainly hit the next generation, but they're going to hit hard at some point. And I made the point to a visitor yesterday that I was showing them the computer mouse that I designed. And you'd buy that for like $19.99. It was the kind of the low-cost mouse. So you go into the shop and you buy the $19.99 mouse, and you kind of go, well, you know, it's an expensive thing. It's not a luxury. It's a necessity. But the true cost of that object is multiples of $19.99. The true cost of it, mining the materials, extracting the petroleum, burning the petroleum, running the injection molding machines, using electricity, using energy, us flicking a switch bears no comparison to lighting the fire. I mean, imagine a time, I mean, some of you still do this, you light a fire every day, especially during the winter, and you wish you had a fire today.
Just for a second, because I think you're about to make the point that I was going to make. When we walked in here, Zeph said to me, oh, that could be the house you used to live in. Yeah. And the house I used to live in wasn't even as nice as that. And I lived in it for about 5 years. And I'm fully on board with all this, the talk about design and all the rest of it. I'll tell you the reason I moved out of the house. Because it was really fucking hard. It was really hard. It was cold, it was damp. The roof didn't quite meet the top of the wall plate, so when you sat up in bed in the morning, the wind whistled across your nose. Come home from work and you'd have to light a fire and then do 10 other jobs because the house wouldn't be warm enough to sit in until you'd done that. So I think that I get the bigger, grander scheme, but I think there's a danger potentially of this becoming like a discussion about the same way there was a discussion about organic food in the 1990s, and it's all those that can afford it can buy the organic food, but actually for most people it's beyond their reach to be able to. Yeah.
So my response to it is.
Sorry, and that may not have been the point you were
No, but my response to it is that ultimately we all as people, we want to have the insulated home. We need the insulated home or whatever it might be, but it has gone to the point of excess, I believe. I mean, I may be wrong, but I think it's gone to the point of excess where we are sort of disconnected from the consequences, the longer term consequences of being able to just flick a switch to have a light, or being able to flick a switch to turn on the heat, which is an absolute luxury, and it's a necessity, you could argue. Heat, warmth, shelter, basic necessities. But do we have to do it in the way that we are doing it? Can we do it in a more responsible way where we are not using quite so much energy? Or maybe we should feel that we should go back to using a bit more human energy instead of energy produced by burning fuel and burning the world in a way in order to keep ourselves warm today. And there is a need to get a balance, and I recognize that there's no magic wand, and we do need to have the warm home. But what I'm asking designers especially to do is to kind of figure out a way of understanding that people aren't going to know the consequences of what their choices are. And if you as a designer can somehow think for the end user and build in as much anticipation of consequences as possible to make a better decision in terms of what you're doing. So it's not about not using plastics or not using petrol or whatever it might be. It's about just if you have to use plastic, or if you have to use insulation in the home, or if you have to use electricity to achieve a function, that you do it with you make the best decisions that you can. You go for the least worst option in that particular case.
That might not always be your choice. I mean, you're
when it is
from a client that you might have to.
Well, for me, this goes back to my idea is that I want people to increasingly, and it's a choice that you make. So I chose to leave Design Partners, for example. That was a choice I made in order to follow my own moral and ethical and whatever you might call it journey. And I paid a price for doing that. You know, it was a good salary, very, very good salary, and it was a good job in terms of being a design consultant. But I was increasingly unhappy, and I guess the motivation is unhappiness. But ultimately, there's all these other motivations which are genuine in my part, in terms of the things that I create. It's a conscience, yes, but I think if more and more designers can have something like that conscience built into their design process, then they will just make better decisions, and the things that you encounter in the store or when you go online to Google something, you might just encounter stuff which is just better made from local materials, or made by somebody that you know. Those few little things which do matter, and then made with a story in mind, made with emotion. So I was talking to an engineer yesterday, and I was saying to him, well, I didn't know he was an engineer, I thought he was a designer, and I was talking about emotion and bringing emotion into the product, and how it was as important as bringing function. So Dieter Rams didn't talk about emotion at all in his principles, but it's the big missing ingredient in his list. It's the massively big missing ingredient, because emotion is at least 50% of anything, any object. Your emotional response to it, no matter what it is, the simplest thing, the simplest discarded thing, if you emotionally respond to something, it's so much more powerful, it's so much more important than the fact that it does something. These things are equally important. Something has to function, yes, but something has to, for me, part of function is the emotional thing. For me, it's part of the function.
Can I just take what Peter's saying, just to finish up on your question to me around the emotional side? That's the bit that I'm saying is hard to expose in the design process at the moment, but is absolutely essential to the delivery of a new piece of design. That everything's focused on the rational understanding of why a product exists, what's its benefits, who will it reach, how many will we sell, what cost will it be, is it shippable, all rational criteria for absolutely everything. But nothing of any consequence in design happens unless it's got a real strong emotional connection that's not about measuring data or rational things at all.
But all those rational criteria are actually to do with a strategy of growth, which I kind of think is the problem.
I was struck when you were talking about the 90% of rubbish. I walked into my local hardware store, it wasn't Woody's, and I just saw this Christmas tat everywhere. And it was all pink. And I was just wondering, when did Christmas become pink? Not that I have anything against pink.
Well,
That's the Barbie effect.
Probably is.
Rubbish. And I'm thinking, where's that? And people are going to go in, they're going to buy all this stuff because it's presented in front of them. They're not going to think about the consequence of all that. And it really struck me. I was quite upset about it, and I didn't know why I was upset about it, but when you were talking...
There is, to put some light in the room, there's a generation of young people, very few in this room now actually, and I wish there was more, who are coming behind who are very conscious of this stuff.
Yes.
Like really conscious. And it's fantastic. And they're fully awake. It's not just about the designer. It's not the designers alone, although I'll take my punishment. It's not just about the designers or the engineers or the business people or the growth strategists or all these people who are trying to drive, like, you know, careers and growth for people. And yes, greed is there. Greed is definitely a big thing there. There's also consciousness and responsibility on each one of us as consumers. So to me, all of it is about conscious behavior. Designing awake with commitment and consciousness, not sleepwalking things into existence, consuming, mindlessly shopping on a Sunday just to kill the day. What's that about? You know, going into Woody's, buying pink tat for your house and then throwing it out in January, or worse, setting fire to it, right? It's full consciousness needs to happen, and that's, to me, is at the center of this. It's not just about the things we create, it's the whole relationship.
And just on that, going back to Steve Jobs, the bit when I read his biography, and it's an excellent read, but if you go back to when the Mac was designed, every part of it was designed. The back as well, so we consciously looked at all parts of it, including the parts you didn't see, to the extent that the names of all the designers were engraved on the inside of the back. Nobody ever saw that. It was an added cost to manufacture, but he cared and the team cared about what they were doing. And I suppose if there was anything that I take from Jobs, it's about the care that he put into it and conscious thought about what they were designing.
But also revolutionised.
Yes,
like we moved from a graphic user interface, to a graphic user interface, and designed by a woman, Susan Kerr, who doesn't get acknowledged. No, most of the time. Anyway, go on.
I want to kind of come from that and just ask Angela, I will
speak to you about your experience as a maker as well, but as somebody who's very involved in educating the next generation of young designers, what you see in terms of the values that they hold. Can you give us insight into that?
Yeah, I would agree completely with Cathal. There is a whole new generation coming up. I had a student say to me yesterday, oh my God, since I was 6 years old, everybody's been telling me that I have to redesign the world, and it's, you know, it's up to them to, you know, come up with the design solutions for the mess that we have all created, you know. And so they've grown up with this idea that they are the designers to change the world, change the systems, change the way that they work. When I finished my degree in '97, we didn't really even think about the materials. Like I inherently just use kind of mainly sustainable materials anyway in my practice. But the majority of people wouldn't even look at where the provenance of the materials came from, or, you know, how they were manufactured, any of that. But now the students that we have, and that's explicit, like sorry everybody, I lecture in NCAD in fashion and textiles and jewellery, so we're really the making area, and the making and designing through process and all of that in the college. But the students are taught the traditional craft skills, and we explicitly now bring in other projects with sustainability, diversification, you know, designing with design partners last year, with a jewellery student making a glucose badge, you know, to wear. So they're thinking in a much more transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary context. It's not just good enough just to design in your specialist area anymore, and we call it the T-shaped students. You know, they're designing in their discipline, but then they have this whole other broad skill set that they can work into different areas of design. And now we're looking at the creative attributes that students need going out into the world. So what are they? Their empathy, you know, being an authentic designer.
Curiosity.
You know, curiosity. Our mantra in NCAD is be bold and curious. That's in our mission statement. You know, we want these people to really think outside the box, to, you know, discover, to be playful, to really work with the materials that we have. We're going back to natural dyeing. We're going back to working with Galway wools, Donegal yarns, looking at really the provenance of the materials that we have in Ireland, you know, looking at other companies like Moore Textiles who are doing a whole project in around flax, you know, and they're, you know, growing, they're going through the whole process. Why aren't we doing all of this and bringing back these local industries into our design disciplines as well? So it's not just craft or art, it's, you know, it's a whole combination of all of that. So absolutely, as Cathal said, the designers, they really are conscious about what they're doing, but also the emotional aspect. They have the luxury to really develop that emotion within their work. And they are looking to kind of sources of the vernacular and cultural history and all of that as sources of inspiration to feed that process as well. So they're a really intelligent bunch coming up behind us. So yeah, I think we're in good hands, yeah.
And I'm really conscious that a lot of what we've talked about is sort of mass production and design on that scale. But Claudia, in your book, the objects that you were looking at were very different. They were much more of what we'd call vernacular objects. And something that occurred to me, Linda, when you were speaking about that trajectory of Irish design history was labour and time. And I wonder, Claudia, could you talk a little bit about that, about the kinds of objects, some of which, like the heather brush that you brought?
Well, I suppose I've brought about 10 different objects, and I was sitting and thinking about them. Nearly all of them were produced locally, or they were produced out of local materials. That they're all Irish-produced objects, and I brought them for different reasons. I mean, I suppose my book's talking about life in the Irish farmhouse from 1700 or earlier up to, you know, the late 20th century. And one of the things that comes through is that the rural population, you know, on the whole, they weren't affluent. They didn't have very much choice about what they had. In the words of Glenn Adamson, they had fewer, better things. So, you know, this crock, which is a really lovely thing that Peter asked me to bring, which was made in Coal Island, County Tyrone, a beautiful, beautiful trail slipware crock, was made in Coal Island where they had the right kind of clay to make that. You know, they went ahead and they mass-produced these for probably 200 years. And, you know, it's a really fine example of what could be made because they had the clay locally. You know, and in Youghal, they had 40 potteries in Youghal and East Cork because they had the right kind of clay there for that kind of pottery. So this would have been used not only for setting your cream, but you'd have been washing your potatoes in it, you'd been washing your hands in it, it would have been your washing up bowl, maybe you washed your hair in it. I've come across crocks like this which are worn across the top, with the glaze has been worn away by the women's hands through use. So, you know, that's a lovely example of something that did many, many different jobs. You know, and then there's this little spoon which is made out of the horn of a cow. They're quite rare now. There's about 120 of them in Irish museums, but they didn't waste anything. So when the cow died, you know, the bones were used and the horn was used, and spoons are a lovely example of what could be made from a cow horn. I won't explain how, it's quite a complicated process. You know, and then there's this little object which is called a noggin, which would have been made, we're talking about specialist craftspeople. I mean, this is a really complicated little tiny barrel. It's made like a tiny barrel. It's made of oak and ash. No metal is used at all, and no glue, actually. So I took it to Cooper at Pernod Ricard, Middleton, and I said, oh, you know, let's see if you can do something like this. I'd like to see what you make of it. And he immediately set to and made 2 or 3 of them, and then told me all about, you know, it couldn't be made any smaller. It was really fantastic. You had to use metal hoops. This is an ash hoop. And when I researched it, I spent about a year researching noggins, which were used for porridge and water and flour. They were used for everything, dry and wet ingredients for water. You drink out of it. You know, it's got this little stave handle. You wash it up and then you'd turn it that way up and it would sit properly because of the way the handle's made to dry in the air. But the noggin weaver was derided in the 19th century by other woodworkers because he only made noggins.
Why make anything else?
I mean, if you can make something without any glue that holds water out of little tiny bits of oak, for goodness sake, you know, he'd be knighted now. So, but he was derided because he only made noggins. You know, I just think it's the most fantastic, very complex, very lovely functional object, and I haven't met anybody yet who can reproduce one. So, we'll see, there's a challenge. And I mean, the heather brush, which actually I was given by Linya's father, this little hearth that we're sitting in front of, you know, there was a brush like this by the hearth, and Pat Egan uses it to sweep the hearth, and he just gave it to me, and I said, this is amazing, you know, this is a very traditional object, and he handed it over to me. And when I looked into brush making in Ireland, there were specialist brush makers, and they knew exactly what kind of heather they wanted to use. It was a particular type of heather. It would be used repeatedly until it was so worn down, there was nothing left, until it was so short that then you'd use it for scrubbing your barrels. It would have another use, basically. It wouldn't be thrown away. So, you know, this was a local, natural, lovely thing. And, you know, and then things were mended. I brought this little stool along. There's a frugality about traditional vernacular objects. So this stool, like so many others, it's called a creepy stool. So it has its little wedged legs, and they're all splayed very carefully. It's quite a subtle splay. And they're all wedged at the top, so you can see the wedges that hold the legs in place, and one of the legs has been replaced, and this is typical. So if one of the legs broke or it wore down, the householder could replace it, him or herself, and that's very typical that it's got a different leg. And then when you look underneath it, you've got all these marks from axes, and somebody's put it on the floor and chopped the wood on it, and that's because they wanted to save the axe, or they wanted to save the flagstone floor, or they wanted to save the earthen floor. So it often had 2 purposes, and when I've looked in museums, and I've spent so much of my happiest times in museum stores. So I've looked at lots and lots of creepy stools, and I always turn them the other way up. And there's one in Omagh, in the National Museums of Northern Ireland stores, which is like the bite out of an apple underneath. It's been used to chop so much that it's just fantastic little object. It's brilliant. It's lovely. So they have many, many uses, and they went on forever because the legs could be replaced.
Where does the name come from, Creepy?
Creepy is a kind of a northern name. I'm not quite sure. You know, it's quite nice not to have all the answers, isn't it? So, I mean, I suspect it looks like something that might have been a creepy crawly. I'm not sure. I have a smaller one, but it didn't have a replaced leg, so I didn't bring that today. This also has a date underneath it. So these were really, really common, very widespread. If you didn't have a chair, you might have this stool. You'd have your meal off it, or you might sit on it. You know, it would be something you prepared food on. So everything had lots of uses, and there was a frugality about things which I think we've forgotten. You know, the perfectionism of the noggin is one thing, but then the householder might make his or her own furniture, and the Sugaun chair over there, that's got most of the Sugaun chairs in this room have got string seats, but the first earlier ones would have had Sugaun seats, and this is a bit of twisted straw rope. So this, you know, you'd have made it yourself, you'd have cut it yourself, you'd have twisted it yourself with a companion, and you'd have seated the chair, and then you'd have reseated it yourself. So it was a bit of upholstery that was homegrown and cheap, and it wouldn't have lasted forever, but you would be expected to replace it. And I love that, keeping things going, you know, building a dresser that has a replaceable foot on it, so that when the damp floor eventually gets to the bottom of the dresser, you just replace the feet instead of the whole dresser. So that's a really long-term view of making sure that things keep going for a long time.
That connects back with what Linda was saying about the more recent, more industrial history, where there was a sort of a rejection of the things that were you made yourself or that you fixed yourself, or the handmade object. Even if it was a local, quite skilled carpenter that was doing it, there was a rejection of that towards the thing that was...
Yeah, and I mean, we've had a rejection of, you know, I won't quote you, but you couldn't wait to get out of the place that you didn't like. And Peg Sayers talked about her house on the Blasket Island. She said, I couldn't wait to get out of the horrible old hole. She really, you know, it was very, very hard. She had a damp floor. She was carrying water. She was lighting the fire. It probably didn't light sometimes. She lost her children on the cliffs. You know, I can understand that rejection of discomfort and the need for comfort, which is innate in all of us. But I do think we can learn a lot about, you know, making things last a bit longer, keeping things, not having 6 things when you can have 1. You know, the noggin was one thing, but the basin was another. You know, you drink your tea out of it, you'd eat your porridge out of it, you take it out into the fields, turn it upside down and keep it on the dresser. And then, in the words of Arthur Young in the 1770s, you know, he liked what he saw in Ireland compared to England because there were broken teacups wisely kept for show on the dresser. And I mean, in Japan, we've probably all heard of kintsugi, where they, you know, the cracks are all carefully gilded, and they make a virtue out of repairing things. You know, and I do think, you know, this little plate, which is you know, Regency Spode, it's cracked and it's stapled, and you know, somebody kept it going. I mean, and the noggin weaver and the cooper would come back to the house where they'd sold the coopered vessel, and they would repair what you have. They'd come back and they'd say, is there anything that needs mending? And the traveller and the tinker would do the same thing. So there was a sense of responsibility.
But there was some point, was it the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, where we rejected that notion of this wasn't good enough to have a broken plate repaired in your home.
Oh, no.
You wanted to go and get the new one.
We had notions.
We got notions.
It's funny, the stapling is actually the reason the kintsugi came about, because the Japanese sent off a thing to China and it came back stapled together, and they thought it was so ugly that they had to come up with their own way of doing it.
Well, that's maybe one story, but I mean, I was reading that there are other stories. The samurai, you know, if they broke a piece of crockery, you know, they had to be abjectly apologetic. They couldn't just say sorry. They had to show that the thing was venerated, and so they would mend it with gold, you know. So that's maybe, I mean, there's probably several
that
different
sounds like
versions.
A romantic story.
But I mean, I suppose
neighbours is better.
Nowadays we would throw away a broken plate because they're cheap, but this was actually my grandmother's plate, you know, and quite a lot of the the transferware I've inherited from her has got staples on it, and I rather like that, and little chips which have been painted.
Part of its history.
It is part of its history, and it's part of the set, so you wouldn't want to get rid of a plate. And it's still a lovely thing. I
think it's really interesting we have a relationship in a community between the maker and the people who use the product.
Yeah.
Because you're in the same community, it kind of intensifies the need to make something of value.
Yes.
Because you're going to meet each other, you're living in the same community.
You're right.
And I thought about this recently. I moved several years ago down to Wexford. I live in rural Wexford, but I lived previously for quite a long time up around Bray and in Dublin, things like that. And one thing I really noticed going back, because I'm from a rural background, but that I realised going back, in North Wexford, there's a lot of tradespeople, and they service South Dublin. So if you want a plumber or an electrician or a roofer, North Wexford is the place to go to live. Not only that, they love doing jobs in the local community because they don't have to travel up to. And when they do it locally, they really do it because you're going to meet them at the GA pitch next weekend. And it's very similar, kind of like the proximity of the responsibility.
And accountability.
And we're not removed from it.
So if your chair breaks or the leg breaks, you know, the man that made it would probably come and fix it for you, or you'd be able to fix it yourself because it wasn't made in a complicated way.
Next door, there's not a lot of stuff I'd want next door except that walnut chair, which is absolutely beautiful. But if everybody in the room here wanted something as beautiful and probably as precious and something that would become an heirloom in your house out of walnut, we probably couldn't supply it. It takes 100 years for the raw material to grow. So that's why people are living on plastic chairs, because you just get a barrel from Saudi Arabia and you put it into whatever sort of machine it is, and out comes a plastic chair. But it's valueless. It's not something you're going to hand on. So we need to think more long term about how are we going to get 100,000 walnut trees growing here so that everybody can have a beautiful walnut seat.
We do need to plant more trees, actually, and Ireland is one of Europe's most deforested nations. It still is one of Ireland's most deforested nations, and it has been ever since the 18th century.
Zeph, that ties in with an idea that I'm forming in my head, which sounds very obvious when I say it. I want to become a designer that is metaphorically planting a woodland in the work that I do. And the woodland will be a mix of the hazel and the willow that you can coppice relatively quickly and repurpose into objects, but also the oak and the walnut that takes generations, decades to grow before it can be used. But we need to have a whole cycle of not only designers, but the people, farmers, politicians, everybody gearing towards this idea of building a society and infrastructure and resources for the long term, for the future, for hundreds of years' time, and next year, and all of that. And for me, the best metaphor is the woodland, which has this mix of things that you can use right now. You can pick the berries from the bush next year, next season, but you can also plant the oak, which is fully grown in 100 years' time or whatever, to be brought into use for furniture or whatever it might be. And we don't do any of that. We planted, like 30 years ago, we planted spruce forest all over the country, and it's due to be all cut down now to be replanted, which is all kind of happening. And Quilta are only just getting into the notion of, actually, we should be planting woodland, not spruce forest, but this diverse mix of woodland, which can provide resources for now, but also for the very, very long-term future. And all I can do in my own practice is to think that way. So when I'm creating, I'm not just creating a woodland made up of willow and hazel, wonderful as they are. I'm also planting the oak. I'm also planting the walnut, and thinking about what the next generation will do with those materials.
So what you're describing there is a very sustainable way of thinking, and I am interested in asking you, Michael, to talk about sustainability in a different way, thinking about it as a maker. How sustainable is it to be a maker?
My man. Yeah, to be a maker, how sustainable is it? I guess taking the sort of notion of tonight, walking backwards into the future, and look at all these tables and the materials from a time gone by, which were all objects of necessity. Everybody, they actually needed it. If you couldn't get someone to make it, you'd make it yourself, you'd figure it out. And they were satisfying a true need, almost as much as shelter. And when I think of my position today, I make things which are not necessary really, because all those necessary things have been taken care of by industrialization. Your 1,000-barrel chairs of plastic, you know, those are all readily available to you. So when Cathal talks about rational behaviors in design and things, I'm actually appealing to irrational behavior. I'm appealing to emotion and trying to satisfy a new need, because if I'm not strictly necessary for the products that you want, I have to find out how I can be necessary in today's society. And I think what I can do is I can imbue objects with a sense of humanity and create emotional responses. If I'm to make a chair, it can't just be to hold you up and stay solid. It has to give you a feeling. You have to put your hands on it and find little bits of hand-carved data, human elements. And that's really led me to make from, you know, strictly using hand tools, basically using local materials, trees that have been storm felled and they're local to me, and creating that sense of provenance within the piece for the personal client, because I'm always dealing with immediate personal clients and measuring them up for a chair, or talking about, you know, how many kids are you actually going to have, or something like that. And yeah, so how sustainable it is as a maker is kind of down to the broader public and the value you see in having things made from our local resources, and in keeping skills within the hands of the people of the country, because your fingers are not just made to tap screens. I, for years, studied law, and I became absolutely disillusioned with the idea of spending my life in front of a computer and arguing with people. And it was only through discovering the utility of my hands and connecting both my hand and mind to create functional or sculptural objects that I've found satisfaction in life. It's amazing what it can do for you, and it's great whenever I teach people sometimes as well. And in a day, you can see people waking up, you know, finding that these aren't just little things at the end of your arms. And yeah, Peter was saying earlier, we made this chair together, the stick chair inside, and he provided this amazing schematic drawing, and then he hands it to me, who I never draw anything, and I just kind of make from instinct, I guess, and eyeing things up. But as a duo, me learning from your aspect and your sense of form, it's been great to have that companionship in producing a piece. But we always talk about how sustainable this can be and how we live on an island. This island only has so many people with enough money to buy walnut chairs. You know, that's they're few and far between. So it's very difficult as a maker. You have to think globally, even if you are in this small personal thing. I'm not going to sell 100 million mouses. I bloody hope not.
But I mean,
yeah.
you'd probably also repair a chair that you'd made. You would feel responsible if something happened, and you want to be the one to fix it.
Not that would ever happen, Claudia. But I'm very glad that you brought it up. But yeah,
Never.
No, everything gets a lifetime guarantee. Everything does get a lifetime guarantee. Yeah.
John, are you empathising as Michael's speaking there?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that comes out to me is, and it's kind of funny, it's coming from Cathal, but it's this idea of storytelling and bringing value to a thing. And that's with my work as well. It's like, as I say, sustainability, or how practical it is.
As a highly esteemed furniture maker.
Well,
yeah.
but like, I bringing a client on a journey, but it's like not everyone can afford to buy the walnut chair. You know, and like it might take me 5 months to make a cabinet, and I might have spent 10 grand on timber, but you know, that is the problem. You know, it's, you can see where mass production comes in, and it's that fine line you're straddling, and Ireland is a very small market. But it's the idea of storytelling and giving value to the piece, not just not just that it's a chair, but you've kind of brought the client on the journey of designing it. And that's a big part of what I do, is really get the client involved and bring them to the workshop and see them just get, like, I don't use AutoCAD, or I'm kind of very much pencil and paper still. Now, that's probably because I can't use the computer. It's not by choice really, but that's the way I work, and that's what I'm comfortable with. And instead of doing a 3D rendering, I make a scale model, but where the client can give it to them, they can handle it, they can visualize it. It's not just flicking something on the screen. And I can see the benefits of it, and I could probably make more money if I was using AutoCAD and 3D printing and CNC, but...
Well, what's the big question is, how do you bring these things together? So you have the mass-produced and the consumer available thing, and then you've got the locally made artisanship.
I don't know if you have to bring them together.
I think
spectrum. You are creating my market. The apathy to sort of anonymous objects is what creates the need for the human element. So I actually think it's important to have these other ends. You know, being a maker now, if you ask is it sustainable, I think we're actually at a tipping point where people are so far gone, so sick of going into an apartment and being like, I have that table, I have this, you know, people hate it. And so in a way, that's what's creating the potential for a market. And what people are buying, like from John or myself, I've figured out is I'm the product. They're buying me, you know, they're buying a little part of me, and that story that you're bringing them on, that journey, you're the product. And, you know, that's the weird thing, is having to have an internet presence around that and for people to feel involved.
And actually, that's what students are doing so well now. You know, they're not bringing a collector into their studio. They're bringing their iPhone in. They're documenting a process. They're documenting the whole process. And that's what people want to see. And like that, for years, like doing all of the collector exhibitions and that, the collectors, they're buying a piece of you, you know. So if they're viewing, you know, as students, the way they're making their work, that's what's drawing them in.
But you're also creating somebody's favourite thing. In other words, you know, I've got a favourite cup that I like drinking my tea out of. Yeah. And I don't need a whole cabinet full of other cups, because that's the one I want every time. And it's a bit like your chair. It's a unique thing that you'd almost bring from one room to the other to sit in, and it's maybe getting people to think of something that is more precious than just going out and buying, you know, 30 different cups that you don't really like the feel of.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
One thing I'd like to refer to is, because you refer to the walnut chair outside, the history chair outside, and it is an inaccessible product for the vast majority of people. It's incredibly expensive. It takes forever. It takes a month to make one chair. You know, it's unreal, right? But it was an exercise in design between myself and Peter to see how far could you go with, like, kind of reinventing a chair in how it's made, right? That was its purpose, really, to kind of push the boundaries.
And it's unlikely to be thrown away as well, because it is, you know, it's a beautiful object that somebody's considered very deeply. But
the point I want to make is that you can put the same intensity, the same storytelling, the same level of meaning into a €2 piece of plastic. Believe me, like whoever invented the paper clip, that's genius, right? A piece of wire that does something that everybody uses with utility and beauty every day. I wish I did done it, like, you know, that's
You're not going to be
right?
handing it down to your grandchildren, though, saying, here is a paper clip.
No.
No.
But think of what it does. Think of what it has done for people every day from a purpose point of view. So just because it hasn't had a local relationship, or it's a piece of heritage, doesn't mean it doesn't have value. So I make computer mice constantly. You know, we're still doing that. But when we do it with an understanding that the person who's going to use this mouse is going to use it to define their career. They might be an architect or an engineer, or someone who gets their enjoyment, their career, their flow out of creating with a computer. And this mouse is their connection between them and their digital experience. And they're fully immersed when they're doing that. And we design with that intensity, saying this piece of plastic means something to this person and what they want to get out of their life. they want to, you know, create art or animation, or they want to develop skills, become an engineer, an inventor. And this allows that to happen. It's not a throwaway piece of anything. It's really meaningful.
But can you make one that can be recycled?
I've had
Can
people
it be
say to
reused?
me,
Can you make a mouse that's, you know, that is sustainable, please? You know, that's not going to go into landfill in 25 years' time.
and repairable and extendable and new battery and keep going forever, yes. But only now, because only now it's on the agenda, right? So everybody in the chain needs to be involved, right? The designer, the manufacturer, the producer, and the consumer, you know? So when everybody has that consciousness, yes, those things do happen.
I think you're talking to something really, really important. I think that's at the heart of everything. Everybody has their own working definition of wisdom for themselves. And for me, wisdom is when something speaks to my emotion, that I feel it. I don't necessarily, I can't articulate it necessarily, but I know it's the right thing when I hear it. And there's a commonality with all of what you guys are talking about in terms of everybody's referencing storytelling, everybody references connection, sustainability. Peter was talking about the sustainability of his work and planting the forest. And for me, it all distills down into community. And you referenced community at one stage there, and I literally, it just sort of jumped like a joke in my inside of me of, that's it, that's, if we have a sense of community, everything else falls into place. Because you want to ensure that you're creating something that means nobody else is disadvantaged, and that people gain the most they can get out of what it is. And I don't mean that in a, you know, a dog-eat-dog kind of a way, but just that it's not a zero-sum game. Why should my having something mean that you have less? And for me, I think there's a bigger discussion in there somewhere around community and the importance of community and how communities work together. And it goes back to the very first story I think Peter was talking about in terms of people using the things that were around because they were around and they knew the person who did the thing. And yeah, there's something in there. I don't know what it is, but it's there.
There's definitely something in community. And what is community now? Community for a lot of people is not your locality. It's like their connections could be across the globe with like-minded people who kind of share interests, you know.
That has to be the way to see it, not least because we can communicate across the globe. But everyone in the chain, if you like, if you see it as a chain, maybe it's not a chain, maybe it's not linear, but everyone in the chain of things and consumerism and accumulating objects, if we are acting in community, in spirit or in philosophy, perhaps there is a chance.
There's a wonderful Swedish story about the King of Sweden about maybe 10 years ago got a phone call from a guy who said, "Hi, I'm your forester, and we have a plantation of oak trees that's ready for you for the Navy." Now they don't build boats out of oak trees anymore in Sweden, but somebody planted them 300 years ago with the idea that at some point somebody will need a whole lot of oak trees to build ships, boats in the Navy, and they weren't thinking about the immediacy of the gain that they could get in that moment. They were almost doing it as a favour for the people that were coming after them, even though they knew they would never meet those people, but they had that connection to something that didn't even exist. And there's something very powerful, I think, in that.
Do you ever think that we're missing something though, with design being designers? Like I hear everyone's talking and very serious. It's very, there's a big responsibility on us all. And there is, don't get me wrong, there is. You point out something with the pink and you point out something with the Christmas decorations. You said the person came in there, who's buying pink? They don't care. You know, the pink is a kind of a reflection of they didn't want the fucking white Christmas. You know what I mean? Like they wanted the pink Christmas. They wanted to have that. You know? So I think there's an element here that needs to be addressed, which is there's fun. And there's an element of fun that's been lost, I think, in design as of late, where it's very serious and we've all got to make things and it's like, it's fun, we enjoy this. The products we love bring us joy, you pick them up, we love it, you know, it's your product. I think there's an element there that something's missing, is joy and enjoyment of design. That is maybe needs to be highlighted a bit more.
I was talking quite deeply about this idea of emotion, and perhaps it went into partly joy in my toolkit, and I need to rediscover that for sure. But I do feel that joy it's extremely important that we tap into emotion, and joy is probably the one that is most important to tap into. But it can be done without putting toxic glitter onto a Christmas bauble.
And I think there is a lot of joy, and there's
a lot
joy
of without that.
There's a lot of beauty as well in the objects that Irish people make as well.
What I'm saying is, like, you know, the focus of there is beauty in the object, and everyone has different views of what beauty is. But you're looking at the kind of the end consumer, and it's like they need to understand. And you're talking about the stories that you guys have to. I do it too. You know, you have to sell your story, and you have to sell a part of yourself. And it's a marketing thing as well. You know, that's what we're doing. Part of me just goes, you know, I want a person to see the product and just be like, that's beautiful, and not have to know why. You know, we need to know. We need to be conscious, and we need to make those decisions as the makers of the product. But the consumer, in my opinion, you know,
it probably is the deciding factor.
Yeah.
You know, if the chair gives you joy, you'll buy it because you've met that person, you like that chair.
Yeah.
My experience is if you bake narrative into the design work you do, you don't need to tell anybody what it is afterwards. It speaks for itself. So it's not about telling the story, it's about using the story to create the work, and then people who get it just get it. They won't know why. They'll just be able to connect with, oh, that speaks to me.
But can I offer just, like, because we're talking about imbuing emotion into objects and joy into objects. I mean, definitely there are objects that, I mean, the poor iPhone's got a bit of a drama now today. I mean, the iPhone brings people a lot of joy. And in terms of sustainability, sorry, just to come back to your point some time ago, if you think of what the iPhone is replacing, you could fill this table and that table with a computer, a telephone, a camera, a Rolodex, a file, a fax, a whatever, and that's all in your phone now. So is that more sustainable than this? All of this? But then there's the objects, and I just so your teacup really resonated with me because I have a special, not only teacup but a saucer, and it's Arklow pottery because that's what my mother had, a set of Arklow pottery, which I have, and I don't want to use her set because it's sentimental. So I bought myself an individual cup and a saucer, and that brings me joy, and I have a huge amount of emotion invested in that. So I think there's the objects that designers try and put some sort of emotion into, and then there's the objects that we put emotion into. It could be this, it could be this.
And the personal emotion is
Exactly.
10 times more than what any designer can ever put in, of course.
Yeah,
So what I want to do in terms of a design principle or a value is for the designer, and I will come back to this because for me this is the important part of the conversation. For me, the designer, the creator, is building in the potential for this story that you bring to it. But the designer can bring in that potential. You can build some of that in, rather than what Cathal referred to as the kind of the lazy, sleepwalking bit of design. So one of the values that I would add to the list, Dieter Rams's list, is building the potential for emotion and story and joy, or whatever it might be. And we can do that. I mean, the designers or the creators or the makers, that's what we do. But we don't do it. But we don't do it. We don't do it enough.
Like Dieter Rams's objects were so beautiful that they're still. I have a brown, and it's second generation, not the white cotton, not the Snow White Scotland, the next generation, and it's black, and it doesn't work. Sorry, it's a turntable, and it doesn't work because it needs speakers, and it probably needs to be repaired. But it's got beautiful buttons, and I just press the buttons and I twiddle them off because it's lovely. It's just gorgeous. And somebody else would look at that and think, but that's a modernist design classic. That's emotionless.
You have projected that onto
absolutely.
it. And it's wonderful that Dieter Rams was a typical German designer who probably would not use the word emotion in anything. But nonetheless, he absolutely did bring it in. But he was genius. So perhaps, despite necessarily articulating it, he would build it in. What I want creators to do, or designers to do, or people to do, is just bring in that potential in whatever way they can. And maybe we could all be as good as Dieter Rams was doing it.
I've just realised I sound like a really sad person pressing
Not
buttons.
Not at all, no.
I am so sorry. I feel so bad because I feel like we're actually just getting started. But I am watching the time, and it is pressing on, and we don't even really have time for a formal Q&A. So if there's anyone out there who's burning with a question or a comment, yes. Yeah.
Talking about Killjoy and not popular for people to make things. I make things, I love making things, but really trying to meet our emotional needs for just buying more stuff is probably not a great solution to it. And that's really the chain of everything, and the distance from our poor past that we rejected to buy NFI stuff or whatever. And then we're doing the kind of same thing again, so we buy something from Loughnane because there's a kind of status associated with that. I think it's kind of filling, like, it's not even filling, it's just trying to address lack, and making more stuff is just more of the same. And then putting sustainable on it, it just enrages me sometimes.
But maybe it's better to be buying one of Mark's chairs once than to be buying half a dozen IKEA chairs every 5 years and throwing them away because they break and they can't be repaired, and you know they're horrible and nobody loves them.
Not buy the chair in the first place.
I don't know. I think there's probably room for buying special locally produced chairs and supporting a craft. I really do. You know, just as we used to buy things made by people whose names we knew 200 years ago, who came back and repaired them when they went wrong.
I think that's a different thing now. When you're buying a chair like that now, it's not the same as buying something from a local craftsman 100 years ago. I don't think it's serving the same purpose.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it serves the same purpose either. It's and I think that's what I was trying to speak to, is that it's an effort to remedy the sense of anonymity in the objects that are around us. Like, James is an amazing maker and makes really nice stuff, and you know, there's no doubt that someone's home is enriched for having one of your pieces in it. And I do think it's an antidote just to consumerism. I know it's not necessarily sustainable to keep buying things, but I do think it helps to alleviate some of the drabness of the sleepwalking design that you've spoken about.
And to if you look at middle class, who has kind of really old furniture in their house? Either they're poor because they can't afford to buy new stuff, or very rich because they bought chairs like yours and they have them for hundreds of years. Most of the middle classes and the people in society, their aesthetics change. So in 200 years, your cup will be like a piece of clay, probably, you know, in the ground. It's got a landfill that you dig up in your garden. And it's not designed to be, you know, sustainable like the mouse. It just becomes landfill. So, you know, you kind of, things change. And what you might like now, I think, will be something that will last forever. But we move on.
That's sort of talking about styles and things, whereas I think with the emotion, like you said about visiting emotion onto the Arklow pottery, that kind of preserves things and allows them to retain that sense of value, and hopefully they don't wind up being discarded. I think they have a much better hope when they've been created in that sense of emotion, fostered in it through the design and through the enjoyment of the piece over its lifetime, which hopefully is longer for it.
There's also a trend that's happening, and trends, don't look at trends, but it's definitely happening, which is there's a growth in people looking for the human input on the products they're designing. So what marks humanity on a physical object? It's things like imperfection or you know, individual input or uniqueness or not mass produced. This is escalating now because, and I told you I'd say the word. Because of AI coming, you can create perfection of anything you can think of at all.
Yeah.
And in the next 2 or 3 years, there's nothing you can't create to absolute perfection. So therefore, it has no value.
Yeah.
So how do you create human connection? People will look for the things that have the marks of humanity, the marks of creativity. And I work with a lot of big brands that are saying, we need to bring the making back here. We need to push our craft again. We need to learn again, get away from the computers and do this, because our value has just gone when you can create anything to perfection.
Yeah. It's about communicating then as well. I was at a talk yesterday where a guy is in a company making the zips that we all use. And they're saying, you know, in a RAL, they use all the RAL colours. If it comes in at a tiny different shade, you know, they have to throw out thousands of these zips or buttons or whatever. And then it's actually saying, well, actually, could the designers not build that story into their product and say, you know, your button is going to be a very tiny different shade to your button, you know, and build that into the story and the communication of this, so that we're not just throwing out things that are imperfect, you know?
Because we need it to be perfect.
I really would love to keep this going, but I had one job tonight, and I'm blowing it.
You've done it beautifully, and I'm going to introduce Ewan Madden. And is Jeremy there? Is he still taking photographs at the back there? Jeremy Madden is taking photographs today, but he's been instrumental in the journey that I'm on in terms of creating an installation in Connemara that I talked about earlier, and this installation here, and his son is a wonderful musician, and I asked him for the Connemara installation to compose a little bit of music and to play it at the opening of that installation in Connemara, and I've asked him up to play it again tonight as a little evocation of the spirit of that installation on the edge, the north coast of Connemara, a beautiful, beautiful place. And this references the old forge in Renvyle in Connemara. So over to you, Ewan.
Okay. Yeah.
A few of you have gone for a comfort break, but we'll get started. I want to introduce Sheila Flitton, who is the actor who played she's a long career in Irish cinema and stage, but she's the actress who played the Banshee in the film The Banshees of Inisherin. And I think I mentioned earlier that I came across the chair from the film. It was in Pádraig and Siobhan's cottage in the film, and according to Sheila, I think there were some stories around not only Colin Farrell sitting in it, but also the donkey, if anyone's seen the film, and that might explain some of the damage done to it. There's a broken stringer there, but I thought it would be wonderful to bring the Banshee together with her chair again, and I had this chair in the installation in Connemara, and my mother-in-law visited the installation. He said, "Oh, I know the actress who played, or the actor who played the Banshee." I said, "Why didn't you tell me this before? Because you knew I had this chair. We could have done something perhaps down in Connemara with it." But I thought, I'm determined for the next installation that the Banshee would be united with the chair. Now it's a nursing chair. It turned out a visitor to the installation said, "This is a nursing chair, so it's got a low seat and the splayed arms and the high back." And I think Sheila might be a little bit more comfortable in the higher chair, so that's why this is here. So we'll see how that all goes. So over to Sheila.
As rare a sight as could be gifted to a soul, God be praised. You took a foolish old woman and gave her a place made with your own hands. God be praised. You made the mountains rise up hard and bare, an enemy to living things. God bless you, and safe journey across the darkening waters. Was I right not to tell them of Beezy's end, the fall in the fire? The people said with the nuns she could have had years. Her foolishness left her 12 short months. 12 short months. They'd have had me fill a purse like minutes were coins, then spend like a miser, crab it, and with nothing but loss. No! Thank you.